You know, when a massive suspension bridge just suddenly collapses into a river, our first instinct is almost always to look for some kind of, well, some spectacular, undeniable event.
Right,
We
yeah.
want this cinematic cause, you know. We immediately think about an earthquake or a massive explosion or like maybe a runaway cargo ship smashing into a vital pylon in the dead of night.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we inherently want a cause that matches the sheer scale of the destruction. It makes the catastrophic failure easier to process psychologically, I think.
Yeah.
We want a clear villain, right? An act of sabotage or an undeniable act of God. It gives us a sense of order, ironically, to know that something massive is required to break something massive.
But then the structural engineers actually get in there. They, set up their floodlights. They start combing through all the twisted wreckage. And the truth they find is usually infinitely more boring.
Well, for sure.
They don't find a bomb. They don't find seismic activity. They find a micro-calculation error in the load distribution that was just ignored for 20 years. Or they find a supplier who systematically shaved like 2 millimeters off every steel rivet to save 3 cents per unit.
A microscopic, institutionalized fraud.
Exactly.
Repeated 10,000 times over decades until the undeniable math of gravity finally catches up to the structure. I mean, the bridge didn't fail on the day it collapsed, right? It failed on the day that 2 millimeter deficit was accepted as standard operating procedure.
That right there is the perfect framework for what we're doing today. So welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking at a set of lectures by the thinker Ghulam Ahmed Parwez. And he took a famous historical and religious text, specifically the chronic episode of Shu'aib and the Midianites, and completely, surgically stripped away the theological varnish.
He really did.
What he found underneath was a terrifyingly accurate macroeconomic operating manual for why human societies actually fail.
And we need to set some ground rules for you, the listener, right at the start here. We are dropping any preconceived notions of religious sentimentality or, moralistic fables.
Right, leave that at the door.
Exactly. Parwez approaches this text essentially as a master sociologist and a systems engineer. So we are investigating the foundational social physics of civilizational collapse. We're looking at this strictly as a diagnostic text about macroeconomics, supply chains, and social architecture.
So if you are tuning in expecting a Sunday school sermon about, being a good neighbor, you are going to be surprised. Let's just get right into the structural provocation here.
Let's do it.
The story of Shu'aib, who was sent to the Midianites, who are often referred to in the text as the people of the wood, is almost universally summarized in popular culture as this quaint little lesson in commercial ethics.
Right.
The standard summary is basically, be a good merchant, don't put your thumb on the scale at the local bazaar, and, be honest when you sell your grain.
Which, I mean, is an accurate translation of the surface level text, certainly.
Yeah, sure.
The literal words do talk about scales and weights, but structurally, that reading is completely insufficient. What Parwez argues is that reading the Shu'aib episode as just this minor ethical footnote completely misses the fact that it is actually the text's most precise, mathematically verifiable economic diagnosis.
Wow.
His core thesis is that civilizations are not destroyed by spectacular cinematic crimes like murder or pillaging or invading armies. They're destroyed by systematic, institutionalized measurement fraud.
I hear that, but honestly, looking at human history, civilizations usually are destroyed by invading armies, right? Or famines or plagues. How does Parwez justify elevating a rigged grocery store scale above a literal war or a catastrophic drought?
Well, because society with a robust, equitable internal structure can actually survive a famine, and it can repel or eventually absorb an invading army. History is full of societies that bounced back from those cinematic disasters. But a society cannot survive the systemic rot of its own foundational transactions. Parwez is looking at the root cause of vulnerability here. When the internal economic engine is based on fraud, the society hollows itself out.
Right.
So by the time the invading army arrives or the drought hits, the society simply collapses under the pressure because the internal trust and the productive capacity have already been siphoned away.
That makes a lot of sense. It's the shaved rivets on the bridge. The windstorm just finishes the job.
Exactly.
Let's look at the actual blueprint of this rot then. I was reading through the specific injunctions in Surah 26, verses 181 through 183, and the precision of the language is just fascinating.
It's incredibly precise.
It breaks down into 4 distinct sequential clauses. First, it says, give full measure and do not be among those who reduce it. Second, weigh with a straight balance. Third, do not deprive people of their things. And finally, the ultimate consequence, do not spread corruption in the land.
And every single one of those four clauses targets the exact same economic crime from a slightly different angle. The Arabic term used for the balance or the scale is mizan.
Mizan, okay.
Right. And in Parwez's framework, the mizan is not merely a commercial tool sitting on some merchant's table in a market. It is the ultimate symbol of an entire economic justice system. It represents the foundational transaction of a society.
Okay, so we're talking about the macroeconomic relationship between capital and labor.
Yeah.
We aren't just trading camels and grain anymore.
Exactly.
In modern terms, this translates to systemic wage theft. It's about negative sum extraction being codified as a standard, totally accepted business practice.
Yeah.
When an economic system normalizes taking more from the productive class than it compensates them for, that system has essentially institutionalized a rigged scale.
That is the exact mechanism. It is the consistent, codified extraction of value beyond what was negotiated. If the foundational transaction is rigged, the entire social architecture is built on a fault line. And Parwez uses three vital Arabic terms from those verses to prove that this is an architectural issue, an issue of deliberate system design, rather than just, a few bad actors making mistakes.
Let's get into those terms, because this linguistic deep dive completely shifted my perspective when I was reading it.
Yeah, it's pretty eye-opening.
The first term, from verse 181, is mugkisin. As I understand it, the root of the word bkhs fundamentally means to give short measure, or to intentionally reduce what is rightfully owed. But Parwez makes a really big deal about the grammatical form used here.
He does, because the grammatical form of mubkidan implies a persistent habitual state. It implies structural underdelivery as a deliberate business model.
A business model, not just a one-off.
Right. We aren't talking about a cashier who is just bad at math and accidentally gives you the wrong change. We are talking about a corporate policy designed in a boardroom to shave a fraction of a cent off every single transaction, fully knowing that the sheer volume of those transactions will generate massive unearned profit for the company.
It instantly makes me think of shrinkflation, which is arguably the most visible modern version of mubkizin. You go to the store and buy the exact same box of cereal with the exact same packaging for the exact same price.
Right.
But the company has systematically reduced the actual weight of the contents by 10%. Or consider the digital economy, a software platform that subtly throttles a creator's reach unless they pay an undisclosed premium. It's a mathematically calculated, systemic reduction of value being delivered.
And importantly, the consumer or the worker is largely powerless to negotiate it. The system is designed to make the extraction invisible, or at least normalized to the point of just total resignation.
Yeah, you just accept it.
Exactly. That structural underdelivery stands in direct opposition to the second term Parwez highlights from verse 182, which is kistas mustakim.
Which is usually translated as the straight balance. The root word there is quist, which, if I'm right, forms the basis for concepts like justice, equity, and proportionality.
Yes. The kistas mustakim is the required precondition for a functional economy where exchange creates mutual benefit. It is the exact opposite of the mukzin business model.
The way I visualize the straight balance is a completely frictionless, perfectly equitable economic exchange. You provide an hour of labor or a specific good that generates a specific amount of value. And in return, you receive exactly that amount of compensation. No more, no less, with absolutely zero hidden extraction. It's the image of a perfectly level scale where both sides of the equation hold equal weight.
That analogy captures the economic physics perfectly. It is a system without bleed. But a rigged system inherently bleeds value from one side to the other, which brings us to the third term from verse 183. Shatabkasu al-nasa ashahum. Do not deprive people of their things.
The word asha, meaning their things or their rightful property, really jumps out here because the text is explicitly validating that the labor or the value created by that labor belongs unequivocally to the person who produced it. It is their thing.
Right, it's not a favor.
Exactly. This isn't a text commanding the wealthy to be charitable with their own money. It's commanding the system to stop siphoning off the wealth that the working class has already generated through their own sweat and labor.
And that distinction between charity and justice is central to Parwez's entire philosophy. Siphoning off earned value is a structural violation of property rights at the most fundamental level.
Yeah.
And to explain exactly how this siphoning operates in complex economies, Parwez introduces a fascinating related concept from the broader Quranic framework, which is the concept of tatfif.
I was really hoping we would get to tatfif.
Hmm.
When I was reading through the source material, this concept struck me as incredibly specific. It's described as a profound asymmetry in economic transactions.
Yeah, it's very asymmetric.
Basically demanding full measure, even a little bit extra when you are taking your own rights, but actively giving a deficient measure when you are paying others. But how does that play out systemically? It just sounds like simple individual hypocrisy to me.
Well, it's much more dangerous than simple hypocrisy. You really have to look at the economic leverage involved. Tatfif isn't just about an individual being selfish. It's about a power dynamic embedded in a contract.
Okay.
It defines an institution that leverages its position to demand maximum extraction for minimum compensation.
So we can see this in modern employment contracts, right?
Mm.
An employer who expects their salaried workforce to answer emails at 10 at night, to work through their lunch breaks, and to just give 110% of their physical and mental energy to the company.
Yo, all the time.
The employer demands absolutely full measure when taking the labor. But then when it comes time for annual raises or profit sharing, suddenly there are intense budget constraints, the economy is tough, and the financial compensation ends up reflecting maybe 40% of the actual value that the worker generated.
Exactly.
That deliberate structural asymmetry is tatfif.
And Parwez goes a step further, noting how dominant economic systems inherently rely on this exact asymmetry just to function. Think about the fundamental logic of an extractive enterprise. An employer hires a worker specifically because that worker generates more value than their wage costs. If a worker generates $100 of value a day on a factory floor, and the employer pays them $10, pocketing the 90, the employer justifies it as the necessary reward for capital or the risk premium.
Right, standard capitalism.
Right. But Parwez argues that the margin of that discrepancy, when it is institutionalized, protected by law, and pushed to the absolute extreme to keep the worker at a mere subsistence level, is the literal definition of a rigged scale.
And there's a really dark mechanic to this system regarding the supply and demand of labor that Parwez points out.
Yeah, good.
To keep those wages at $10, the system intentionally keeps education, what Parwez calls the development of higher human capacities, unaffordable or largely inaccessible for the masses. The goal is to ensure a permanent oversupply of cheap, desperate manual labor. Because if you have 10 jobs and 100 desperate workers, you can drive the wage down to bare survival levels. The scale isn't just rigged at the transaction point. It's mathematically rigged against the worker before they even walk into the factory.
Which leads us directly to the ultimate inevitable societal consequence mentioned in the final clause of those verses. Mafsidin fi al-ard, which translates to spreading corruption in the land.
The ultimate curse.
Right. Parwez is emphatic that facade, this corruption, this disorder, this total breakdown of the productive structure is not some abstract moral failing. It is the direct mathematical social byproduct of measurement fraud.
I want to break down how that breakdown actually happens mechanically. Because when every transaction is systematically rigged, trust completely evaporates from the society.
It vanishes.
If I'm a worker or a small business owner and I know that every time I interact with the broader economic system, I'm just being bled dry, my incentive to produce simply vanishes. Why work harder if the surplus value is just going to be extracted by a monopoly?
You wouldn't.
Exactly. Economic exchange contracts. People retreat into the black market or sheer subsistence. The productive social architecture simply collapses under its own weight because the invisible glue of trust is gone.
It's the suspension bridge again. The steel rivets have been shaved down so far across the entire span that the bridge can no longer hold the daily traffic.
Wow.
But the fascinating part of this dynamic is how the people at the top of the bridge, the ones actually benefiting from the shaved rivets, how they react when someone points out the structural flaw. This is where Parwez's analysis of the elite class, which the text calls the mala, becomes absolutely brilliant.
The pushback of the elites is incredibly revealing here. Shu'aib brings this tight, rational, mathematically verifiable economic argument to the leaders of Madyan. He essentially audits their supply chain and their wage distribution. And their response, which is detailed in verses 185 to 187, is astonishing. They say to him, "You are only one of those bewitched. You are nothing but a human like us, and we believe you are among the liars. So drop a piece of the sky on us if you are truthful."
Drop a piece of the sky on us. It is the ultimate demand for a supernatural spectacle.
Yeah.
But look at the context. Shu'aib hasn't brought a supernatural claim to the table. He hasn't claimed to be a magician. And he hasn't asked them to worship a new idol. He has brought a structural critique of their accounting practices.
Right. You don't need a miracle to prove a scale is rigged. You literally just need a standard weight. You can audit the books. You can mathematically prove the extraction. It's an empirical claim. So why are they demanding a piece of the sky to fall? It seems like a massive non sequitur.
It seems like a non sequitur, yeah, but it's actually a highly calculated defensive maneuver by an entrenched elite.
Okay, how so?
Well, they are defending a massively lucrative profit model, and they know the math of Shu'aib's audit is entirely indefensible. They cannot engage the structural analysis on its merits because they will lose.
Ah, I see.
So instead, they execute a categorical deflection. They demand a supernatural refutation that they know the messenger cannot provide.
It's shifting the burden of proof into the realm of the impossible. They are essentially saying, unless you can suspend the laws of physics right now in front of us, we don't have to listen to your audit of our ledger.
Exactly. The demand for the piece of the sky is a refusal to engage with the economic evidence. But it is simultaneously a deeply arrogant statement. The elites are stating that absolutely nothing short of supernatural intervention could possibly motivate them to give up their wealth extraction.
Wow.
They are saying, we have the power, we have the money, we control the system. Unless God himself physically stops us, we aren't changing a thing.
To help explain how these elites view the role of religion in their society, Parwez introduces this incredible analogy from the world of sports. He uses the analogy of the cricket 12th man. Now, for you listeners who aren't familiar with cricket, the 12th man is a substitute player.
Right.
They sit on the bench, they bring out water during breaks, they carry the equipment, but they are not part of the core strategy of the game. They don't bat, they don't bowl, unless there's an absolute emergency.
It's a profound way to look at the sociology of religion. Parwez argues that the economic elites of any extractive society are perfectly happy to keep God or religion as their 12th man.
Yeah.
Religion is fantastic for private rituals, for weddings, for funerals, or, for leading prayers when there's a national crisis like a drought. The elites will gladly fund the building of massive temples, mosques, and churches. They will sponsor the rituals and sit right in the front row.
Because rituals don't threaten the quarterly profit margin. A private prayer doesn't audit a supply chain.
Precisely. The private religion serves as a pacifier. But the absolute moment Shu'aib introduces the concept of deen, which Parwez carefully defines not as a private set of rituals, but as a comprehensive socio-economic operating system that dictates how wealth is distributed and how contracts are honored, the elites revolt.
They are completely outraged that the water boy is trying to call the plays on the field. The text actually quotes their reaction perfectly. They mockingly ask Shu'aib if his prayers are what's commanding them to stop doing what they want with their own wealth. Basically, wait, what does your personal prayer habit have to do with our macroeconomic policy?
And Parwez provides a striking historical context for this from his own time. He notes that during the movement for independence in the Indian subcontinent in the 1930s, there were prominent religious elites who actually opposed the creation of a new independent state.
Really? Wow.
Their argument was that under the British colonial system, they already had religious freedom. The British allowed them to pray in their mosques, fast during Ramadan, and go on pilgrimage.
But Parwez's critique of that mindset is devastating. He argued that yes, the colonial power gives you permission to perform the rituals of your religion, but you do not have the power to implement the socio-economic system of your faith. The British Empire was perfectly happy to let millions of people bow in a mosque, just so long as the British East India Company and the colonial government controlled the macroeconomic extraction of the entire region's wealth.
That historical parallel perfectly illuminates the Midianite elite's position. They did not care if Shu'aib prayed all day and night. They cared that he was auditing their scales.
Yeah, that's the threat.
A community that builds its entire architecture on measurement fraud does not need theological persuasion to change. It needs structural disruption of the profit model that sustains it.
So if the elites refuse to change, and if the literal piece of the sky isn't going to fall to stop them, what actually happens to this society? How does the story end? This brings us to a foundational concept in Parwez's work. The law of requital, or what he calls mukafade amal. This is the physics of economics.
Mukafade amal is the principle of inescapable cause and effect. It is the idea that human actions have inherent mathematical consequences embedded within them. These consequences don't require arbitrary divine intervention to manifest. They operate through the hardwired laws of the system itself. Parwez applies this concept strictly to the measurement fraud economy.
I want you to really visualize how this plays out over time. Imagine an economy where systematic short measuring is the absolute norm. It's not a bug in the system. It is the defining feature.
Hmm.
Every single transaction includes a structural extraction. You buy a gallon of gas, you get zero point 0.9 gallons. You work to produce $10 of value, you receive $4 in wages. Each and every transaction transfers value from the buyer or the worker to the seller through a hidden variable. What happens to the lifeblood of that society over a decade or a century?
What happens is a mathematically inevitable collapse. Over time, the productive laboring population is systematically impoverished, and the rate of that impoverishment is precisely determined by the margin of the fraud.
The math of it.
Right. If the systemic extraction is 10%, it takes a certain number of generations for the society to bleed out. If the extraction is 50%, the collapse happens much faster.
It creates an economy built entirely on negative sum exchange. Wealth isn't actually being created by mutual cooperation. It's just being siphoned upward into a smaller and smaller reservoir at the top.
Yes.
Meanwhile, the foundation of the society, the working class, the infrastructure, the social trust, dries up and cracks. And the wild part is that the elites think they are immune to the cracking foundation.
They always do.
Parwez notes how these elites build massive, fortified structures of power. They capture the legal system, they build monopolies, they hire private security, thinking they have permanently secured their position at the top of the pyramid. They look down at the impoverished workers and think, these people are too weak to ever overthrow us. We have all the money and all the influence.
But they are completely ignoring the physical reality of the system they govern. The quistas mustaqim, that honest balance we talked about earlier, is not a moral nicety. It is not just a polite suggestion for a utopian society. It is the strictly required non-negotiable precondition for a functional economy. Without equitable exchange, the system will fail, regardless of how many guards the elites hire.
And Parwez brings in a truly fascinating historical and philosophical parallel here to prove his point about the mechanics of extraction. He compares this Quranic framework to the work of Karl Marx.
This part is brilliant.
Now, regardless of where you or I fall on the political spectrum, Parwez's critique of Marx from a pure systems engineering perspective is incredibly sharp. Parwez readily acknowledges that Marx accurately diagnosed the exact same extraction that Shu'aib was pointing out. Marx saw the exploitation of labor. He saw the systemic wage theft by the capitalist class. Marx saw the rigged scale.
He did. Marx accurately diagnosed the Tatfif. He saw the factory owner taking 100% of the surplus value and paying the worker a fraction of their worth.
Yeah.
But Parwez argues that while Marx's diagnosis of the illness was correct, his prescribed cure ultimately failed because it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of human incentive and human development.
Let's really dig into why Marx's solution failed according to this framework. Marx's solution was essentially state-controlled communism. The idea was to abolish the private ownership of the means of production and hand the control of all capital and distribution over to the state.
Right.
The state would then ensure everyone got what they needed. Why does Parwez say this is just another form of a rigged scale?
Because, mathematically speaking, handing all economic power to the state merely replaces a private board of directors with a state bureaucracy. The extraction of value from the worker is still happening. It's just the state doing the extracting instead of a private capitalist. The worker still doesn't own the full value of their labor. But Parwez's deeper critique is psychological and spiritual. He argues that Marx failed because he reduced the human being to a physical stomach that merely needed filling.
That is a phenomenal way to put it. A physical stomach needing caloric input.
Exactly. Marx's system aimed to provide physical life bread, shelter, basic material necessities. And while those are crucial, Parwez argues that the human being is more than just an animal requiring physical maintenance. There is the development of the human self, what Parwez, drawing from broader Islamic philosophy, calls khudi, or the human essence.
And how does khudi relate to the economic scale?
This self, this khudi, only develops through voluntary contribution, through the dignity of autonomous fair exchange, and through a sense of equity.
Okay.
A human being needs to feel that if they produce value, they're fairly and transparently compensated. And that then allows them the freedom to voluntarily use their surplus to develop themselves, support their family, and contribute to society.
That makes total sense.
If you remove that incentive, not just the financial incentive, but the psychological dignity of fair exchange, the system stagnates. When the state dictates every outcome and removes human autonomy, it destroys the incentive for the self to develop.
I see. So the rigged scale of extreme capitalism starves the worker physically by extracting all their surplus value. But the forced homogenization of state communism starves the worker psychologically and spiritually by removing their autonomy and dignity.
Precisely.
Both are failure modes. Both inherently lack the true quistas mustaqim.
Which brings a completely new socio-economic meaning to the text's warning about the punishment of the Great Day. In traditional theological circles, the Great Day is almost universally interpreted as the end of the world, a future day of supernatural judgment and cosmic destruction.
But in Parwez's socio-economic framework, how does he translate that punishment?
In this framework, the punishment of the Great Day is simply the inevitable mathematical economic collapse of a system whose foundational transaction is inherently fraudulent. It is the moment the shaved rivets finally give way and the bridge collapses.
The math catches up.
Right. The law of requital operates through the accumulated compounding consequences of 1 million daily dishonest transactions. The punishment isn't a lightning bolt from the sky. The punishment is hyperinflation. The punishment is a total collapse of supply chains because no one trusts anyone else enough to honor a contract.
Wow.
The punishment is a society where the working class literally can no longer afford to produce the goods the elites rely on to survive.
It's an economic margin call.
Yeah.
The math eventually demands to be reconciled. When the debt of extraction becomes too heavy, the system snaps. That is such a grounded, terrifying way to look at history.
It really is.
So what does this all mean when we zoom out? Let's move to the synthesis of Parwez's argument. We've spent this whole time deep in the weeds of Midianite economics looking at scales and wages. But Parwez places the Shu'aib's episode in a much broader comparative context.
Yes, the whole Surah.
Right. Surah 26 of the Quran doesn't just tell one story. It is essentially a comparative analysis of civilizational collapse. It presents 5 specific chronological case studies of societies that failed.
Yeah, Parwez reads the second half of Surah 26 as a literal taxonomy of failure modes. It's like a diagnostic textbook for systems engineers outlining exactly how societies destroy themselves from the inside out.
Okay.
And they are presented chronologically, with each failure mode becoming more specific, more structural, and more deeply embedded in the daily life of the society than the last.
I want to walk through this taxonomy carefully because understanding the progression is key. Let's look at the mechanics of these 5 failure modes drawn from Parwez's source material.
Sure. The first case study is the Society of Noah. In Parwez's reading, their specific failure mode was epistemological suppression and class-based filtration.
Epistemological suppression, meaning they filtered what they considered to be truth based on who was saying it. The elites in the Noah story explicitly rejected his message because his followers were the poor, the laborers, the lower classes. They literally tell him, only the lowest among us follow you.
Exactly. And mechanically, this destroys a society. If a social system filters valid data, whether that data is truth, warnings, or feedback on systemic health, based purely on the social class of the person delivering the data, the decision makers end up operating completely blind.
They cut off their own sensors.
They sever their own feedback loop. The system fails because the elites refuse to acknowledge the reality of the rot happening at the bottom of the pyramid.
We won't listen to the warnings about the bridge because the guy pointing it out is just a steelworker, not a board member. That makes perfect sense as a failure mode. Then we move to the second society.
Ad
represents the delusion of permanence and physical tyranny. The text describes them as building massive, unnecessary monuments on every high place and brutalizing weaker societies around them.
The mechanics of that failure seem rooted in capital allocation. They misdirected their society's resources away from productive infrastructure and equitable distribution and poured it all into vanity projects and military dominance.
Right. They believed their physical infrastructure, their literal concrete and stone, made them immortal. They thought their architecture might excuse them from the laws of cause and effect, completely ignoring the social rot festering beneath the monuments.
They mistook physical weight for systemic health.
Exactly.
The third case study is Thamud. Thamud's failure was the closure to external exchange and the rapid privatization of common resources.
This is symbolized by the famous story of the she-camel, right? Parwez analyzes the she-camel not as a magical creature, but as a socio-economic test of property rights and access to communal water.
Mechanically, Thamud represents the danger of monopoly over essential natural resources. The elites of Thamud formed a cartel that hoarded the communal water supply, denying access to the vulnerable.
And what happens then?
When a cartel throttles access to the foundational inputs of life, the periphery of the society starves. And when the periphery starves, the labor pool collapses, eventually dragging the wealthy center down with it. It is death by resource strangulation.
Then comes the fourth society, Lot.
The society of Lot represents the breaking of foundational natural and social boundaries.
From a systems perspective, this is about the breakdown of generational continuity. It describes a society that becomes so consumed with hyper-individualism and immediate gratification that it fundamentally upends the basic reproductive and social contracts required for long-term human survival.
Yes.
A society that abandons the regenerative social contracts required to raise and protect the next generation simply ages out. It disintegrates because it stops investing in its own future.
Which brings us to the fifth and final case study in the sequence, Shu'aib and the Midianites. Measurement fraud is a systemic economic practice. And what is crucial to understand here is how the Shu'aib episode is structurally distinguished from the four that preceded it.
It is distinguished by its sheer empirical verifiability. Epistemological suppression or social decay can be somewhat subjective to diagnose in the moment, but a rigged scale is objective math.
It's just numbers.
The she-camel in the Talmud story was an economic test of property rights respect-like. Will you allow the common resource to be shared? But the honest balance in the Shu'aib story is an economic test of transactional integrity. Both of them are asking the ultimate systems engineering question. Does this social system extract or does it exchange?
That distinction between extraction and exchange is the common thread running through all five case studies. Parwez argues that the fundamental unifying definition of civilizational failure is extraction.
Wow.
A social system that takes more than it contributes is doomed. A system that ignores the poor, a system that builds monuments to its own ego while crushing the weak, a system that privatizes common water, a system that breaks natural social bonds, and a system that defrauds every daily transaction. They're all just different variations of an extractive architecture.
They're all negative-sum games. They're all systems that quietly consume their own foundations to fuel a temporary, glittering illusion of prosperity at the top.
And therefore, the mizan mustaqim, the honest balance, is not just a quaint rule for a marketplace. It is the compressed, perfectly distilled version of the rational social operating code.
The operating code.
Every exchange must be honest. Every measurement must be accurate. Every transaction must deliver exactly what was contracted. This is not about HR ethics or making sure your corporate compliance paperwork is filed. It is the foundational social physics of any system that aspires to be productive rather than extractive.
Right.
If your system is extractive, the law of requital guarantees its eventual mathematical collapse. If your system is based on equitable exchange, it has the capacity to achieve permanence.
The foundational social physics of any system that aspires to survive.
That is an incredibly powerful paradigm shift. We've covered massive ground today.
We really have.
We started by looking at a bridge collapse, and we've analyzed how the microscopic shavings of metal, the tiny institutionalized thefts in our daily transactions, the systemic wage theft, the tat thief, are actually the true harbingers of civilizational ruin.
We explored the linguistic roots of measurement fraud, the psychology of entrenched elites who demand supernatural miracles rather than submit to an economic audit, the inescapable math of the law of requital, and finally, a unified taxonomy of why societies fail, from epistemological blindness to resource hoarding.
It really reframes how you look at the economy operating all around you every single day. It demands that we look past the cinematic events on the news and focus relentlessly on the integrity of the foundational transactions taking place in our communities.
It absolutely does. I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this rigorous deep dive. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your week.
Please do.
We've talked a lot today about physical scales, about grocers, and about hourly wages on factory floors. But think about the digital systems you interact with daily. In a world driven by algorithms, by attention economies, and by hidden data harvesting, what does a modern, dishonest scale look like?
That's a great question.
When a social media platform demands hours of your attention, tracks your location, and extracts thousands of data points about your behavior, only to feed you a fraction of the connection or value you were looking for. Is that a fair exchange? Or are the platforms we use every day engaging in mutual exchange, or have they become the new, frictionless engines of systematic, invisible extraction?
It is a vital question for our time. Keep questioning the systems around you and look very closely at the scales they use.
Until next time, keep diving deep.